relevant song, that how much we need the grace of the Lord Jesus in the times in which we live. If you were here last week, and I wasn't expecting to be here this week, but it turned out that I had the 5th of May in my diary in 2 different places, so the other place is one and I'm here again. But last week I was talking about being fishers of men, but I also mentioned in a prayer time that there were, in my local friendship base, if you like, there were 3 couples, all of whom, Christian couples, all of whom he had been married for more than 20 years, who had split up. And I was quite shaken by that. I really was quite shaken. And you say to yourself, I wonder what caused that. I wonder who was to blame. I'll tell you who was to blame. Satan. That's who was to blame. Because it certainly wasn't God's will for these marriages to break up. And it certainly wasn't their desire that their marriages broke up. Now, they may have contributed, I don't know, but Satan has been the author of the confusion. So today I want to look at the role that Satan may have had in these situations and in many others. And we're going to do that by looking at 1 Peter 5, verses 1 to 10. But there's 3 things in this chapter. The first 2 we're going to look over quite briefly because it would be wrong to miss them out. So firstly, we're just going to briefly consider Peter's advice to the leaders, whoever he was writing to. Secondly, his advice to the rest of us. That's the young and perhaps everybody. So there's 3 separate groups here. And then thirdly, there is this warnings to us all about Satan, about the devil. And I want to say something that's quite significant in my mind at this point. In 1989, I had just moved down to Ferndown, to Westmoors, and a few months later I got an invitation to go back and speak at my previous church in Market Harborough. And the guy that invited me said, we've got a subject for you. And the subject was Satan. Wow. I didn't think too much about it, but I did my research, and I went up there and I preached a sermon about Satan. And I've never preached one since, until today. The reason for that is that when we were coming home from Market Harborough down to Ferndown, and that's a journey of about 3 hours, halfway is Oxford, where the A43 meets the A34, and there's a service area just as you come off the M40 motorway down into Oxford. Pear Tree, I think it's called, Pear Tree Services. And as we were coming down towards that, it was our intention to stop there for a cup of coffee. And as we approached it, I said to Myra was my wife at the time, I said, I think we'd better get straight home. Oh no, we need a cup of coffee. I could do with a cup of coffee. It's been a long day. No, we need to get straight home. And so I drove past it. And Myra was quite annoyed with me. She said, I wanted a cup of coffee. You should have taken heed for what I thought. And I said to her, Myra, something in my head says we've got to get straight home. What do you mean? Oh, I don't know what I mean, she said, but something in my head said we've got to go straight home. I got home. I shiver when I think about this. I got home, and just as I was getting to the driveway of my house, someone was breaking my window to go into my house. All they got was the Hoover. That was all they got. They broke in the front and then they broke out the back and took the Hoover with them and then disappeared. They couldn't have stolen a better thing from my point of view, but that's another story. But I've always thought that that was the devil trying to get his own way with me, because I was exposing to these people who I thought He really was. And to be honest, that has put me off ever speaking about the devil since. And I've asked myself, is that right or is that wrong? So one thing I will ask you to do is pray for me after today that, I'll be protected from another ridiculous attack, because it's not impossible, because Satan is alive and well at this point. Let's just go back to the beginning of the chapter again, very briefly, because that's not the main point I want to focus on. But this is a letter written by Peter. And I think it's important just to take a minute to consider a few things about Peter, because he was quite a character. I'm sure you'll all know that, but just to think about it for a minute, who he was. Well, first of all, there's a verse in Isaiah and repeated in Matthew talking about, it says something like, a bruised reed he will not break. And that's could be regarded as a prophetic word in Isaiah. It's repeated in Matthew about Jesus, because Jesus was more than bruised. He was actually killed, so it could refer to Jesus, but it could also refer to somebody like Peter, who was very much bruised along the way in his role, his time as a disciple. So he's quite a character. But really, he was a reed. He was someone who was in some ways quite weak, who was made into a rock. Not the first pope, but nevertheless made into a rock. You might see some of your own characteristics when I tell you some of the characteristics of Peter. He was naturally impulsive. Naturally impulsive. Do this, do that, I'll do this, I'll do that, without giving it too much thought. I can be like that sometimes. Find what to be. Maybe you're like that. But Peter was naturally impulsive. On the other hand, he could be very tender-hearted and affectionate. You know people like that who get good points and bad points. We all have. There's two of Peter's. On the one hand, impulsive. On the other hand, tender-hearted and affectionate. So sometimes he was full of strange contradictions. Sometimes he was presumptuous. I've got various references here. If any of you want to look at these references sometime, I can tell you them all. We haven't time to look at them all now. Other times, he was timid and cowardly. And of course, when it comes to the cross, all of them were timid and cowardly, because we read at that point, they all forsook him and fled. But yet, sometimes he was self-sacrificing. He was willing to give more than he needed to give, and more than could be reasonable for Jesus. Sometimes. At other times, he was quite self-seeking. And he thought, number one's more important than anybody else. Then, sometimes we read about him being gifted with a real spiritual insight, way above the sort of average, if you like. He had this ability to see beyond the current situation. Sometimes, opposite of that, he was very slow to appreciate deeper truth, even when it came from Jesus. He made two great confessions of faith. You'll know one of them straight away. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. These are the words of Peter. And yet, at another time, he's guilty of the most cowardly denial. That is the man who wrote this letter. So he knows a bit about life. He's not lived in some seminary or monastery. He's been in the rough and tumble, and he's had his ups and his downs. But he's really quite a good man, because he prayed for his mother-in-law, so not many people do that. But he's a character. So wherever we are, we can identify with Peter in some ways. And he writes these words. And his first piece of advice at the beginning of the chapter we read to the elders is to feed the flock. So we're changing tack a wee bit here. We're just looking at his practical advice at this point in this chapter. It could seem to be disjointed, but it's all together in these 10 verses. To feed the flock of God. What does that mean? This is for the elders or teachers in the church. I presume it's elders. If you're an elder, you have a responsibility to teach, not necessarily to preach, but to teach. So that means you've got to take the initiative when it means teaching others about the Word of God and what we should be doing as Christians, as believers, as servants, or worshippers, as worshippers, to feed the flock, to be overseers, to be aware of what's going on in the big picture, and to give pastoral advice and personal care where it's needed. Not necessarily just on your own, but it's your responsibility to identify as leaders, to feed the flock, to be overseers by personal care and oversight. And most of all, perhaps, to be examples. And Peter says you're not to be an overseer because you have to. Someone's wanted you to be an elder and you say, well, there's nobody else to do it, so I'll do it. That is not the attitude at all. You've got to be an elder, not because you have to, not out of a sense of compulsion or duty, but because of a willing spirit. I'm sorry I'm not reading these verses directly from my Bible, but I've not got my reading glasses yet, so I can't do that. But you'll see it in these verses. One commentator says this, that Peter, or an elder, should be more concerned about the flock than about the fleece. Now, I had to think about that. What does that mean? And I'm thinking about the shepherd with his sheep, and he's got a sheep, and that sheep has got a fleece, and that fleece has got monetary value, hasn't it? So he's not interested in the monetary value. This is my interpretation. I didn't read this in a book. That's just what I think it means. He's more concerned about the fleece, about the flock, than the fleece. So the person is more important than everything that's round about them. The person themselves is more important than their car, their house, anything. The person at the flock is more important. And another thing about an elder is not to be bossy. Did you know that? An elder is not to be bossy, even to their wife. I just said that when I saw your look there, Ivan. But they've to be examples. They've to be examples. I'm sure they all are examples here. I'm sure they are. And then Jesus says, and when Jesus comes, a crown of glory will be yours. So what do you get out of being a good elder? A crown of glory. That's good. I'm sure there's other ways of getting a crown of glory, but that's perhaps one of them. And then his advice to everyone else in the next few verses, down to about verse 11. Not down to verse 11, verse 7, I think. 4 things about everybody else. I'm not saying they don't apply to the leadership necessarily, but first one is to submit to the leadership. Well, that's sort of obvious in a sense, but also be subject to one another. Don't think yourself that you're more gifted or more important or more diligent or more friendly or more hospitable than other people, even if you are. Don't think that. Be submissive, subject to one another. And the way you'll do that is the next thing it says, is to be humble, not to be self-seeking. Be here to give and to play your part and to be friendly and to be helpful and so on. If we're all like that, then there's going to be this harmony that we would all appreciate. And then there's this next phrase that is very familiar to us all. I'll quote it from the Authorized probably. Casting all your care on him, for he careth, or he cares for you. Now, I thought that just meant if you've got a problem, take it to God. Well, that's right, that's what you should do, take your problems to God. What it also means, I think, is don't lump it on everybody else who can't do a thing about it. What is the point? You might say you can share a problem, but it could go beyond sharing a problem to having a right moan. And that's what I think Peter's getting at here. Cast your cares, cast your problems, take your complaints to God. He will listen. We can speak to our Father about anything, and he can speak to us in return. But don't wear everyone else down with our problems that they can't do anything about. Unless, of course, it's something that should be shared and you want prayer. That's a different matter altogether. But primarily, take our concerns, our troubles to God. And then the last one to everybody is this one: be sober, be vigilant, because Satan's around. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting. Because we read these verses in 1 Peter. And I'm going to just ask a few questions, and answer them as well, I hope, about Satan, that hopefully will help us to understand a bit more. Who actually is Satan? Who is Satan? Well, Satan was created as a holy angel. If we look at Isaiah chapter 14 and verse 12, we'll see that he was indeed the highest created angel. So he wasn't always bad. He was created as the highest angel. He became arrogant in his beauty and his status, and he decided he wanted to sit on a throne that was even higher than God's throne. We can find something about that in Ezekiel 28:15 and also in 1 Timothy. And his pride led to his fall. It didn't work out for him in the end. Because of his sin in the Isaiah verses, he was permanently removed from his exalted position. He became the ruler of this world and the prince of the power of the air. That is a very strong statement to take from God's word, that he is the ruler of the world and the prince of the power of the air. And that phrase, the prince of the power of the air, well, in the first century, I don't know what that meant, but in the 21st century, we can think about drones and cruise missiles, and they are the power that's in the air that are doing so much damage around the world at this point. Or we can think about social media and all the rubbish and sinful aspects of that are all transmitted through the air, which is all around it. And here the Bible says 2,000 years ago that Satan is the prince of the power of the air. Revelation 12:10 also says that Satan is an accuser. In other words, he can cause you to feel you're no good. He can cause you to feel that you're too bad to be a proper Christian. It can cause you to think that some moral sin that you committed 25 years ago hasn't really been forgiven. He is an accuser. He is a tempter. He's a tempter. And of course, he even tempted Jesus himself, if you remember. So if he can tempt Jesus, he can certainly tempt you. But remember that we're told that there's no temptation comes to us, but which there is also provided a way of escape. We tend to forget that little bit. So he's an accuser, he's a tempter, and he's also a deceiver. Right back in Genesis, he was active in the business of deceit. And today, I think he's still all these things. He's still an accuser. He's still a tempter. He's still a deceiver. And sometimes I will now think, if I've got a particular problem, and I think, where does this problem come from? I will think, as I mentioned at the start, it comes from Satan. He roars about, as we'll see, like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And even though he was cast out of heaven, he still seeks to elevate himself above God. He counterfeits what God does. He can even do miraculous things, hoping to gain the worship of the world and encourage opposition to God's kingdom. And I'm sure you can see he's quite successful at that. He is behind every false cult and religion there is, and will do anything or everything to oppose God. So that's who Satan is. Well, why does God not just destroy Satan? That's a good question, isn't it? A lot of people would ask that question. You could get asked it by non-Christians. Why does God not just destroy Satan? And all these problems that we face would be gone immediately. And it is a mystery why God did not destroy Satan completely after he sinned. We know that one day he will destroy Satan by throwing him into the lake of fire, where he'll be tortured day and night forever. It's Revelation 20:10. But sometimes we wonder why he's not destroyed Satan already. And perhaps we'll never fully understand that question and know the answers, but there are certain things we do know about the situation. First, we know God is sovereign over all creation, and this includes Satan. God is sovereign over Satan. Certainly, Satan and his demons wreak havoc in the world, but they are only allowed a certain amount of freedom. We all think that's too much freedom, but there we are. But we also know that God has planned everything from the beginning of time to the end of time. Nothing can thwart God's plans. And things are proceeding, would you believe, exactly on schedule. The Lord of hosts has sworn, this is Isaiah 14:24, as I have planned, so shall it be. And as I have purposed, so shall it stand. So whatever Satan does, ultimately, he cannot stand against God. Secondly, there's this well-known verse to think about. We know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. Whatever God has planned for Satan, this is maybe a hard-to-believe statement, and you might disagree with it. Whatever God has planned for Satan, because it's God's plan, that plan is the best one possible. Well, how does that work? I don't quite know. God's perfect wrath and justice will be satisfied, and his perfect righteousness will be glorified. Those who love him, and that's as I hope, and wait for his plan to be fulfilled, will be thrilled one day to be part of that plan and will praise and glorify him as they see it unfold. All things work together for good. And we look around at suffering in the world. We look at Gaza, we look at Ukraine. We look at these 3 broken marriages. I look at the fact that my first wife, Myra, was killed in a car accident. And then I've got to say to myself, do I really believe that all things work together for good to those who love God? Or am I saying that that's a mistake? Which do you think it is? I think it's correct. I think all things do work together for good. Because the Bible says, thy word is truth. And so it cannot falter, even though we don't understand it. To question God's plan and its timing is to question God himself. It's to express reservations about his character and who he is, his judgment. It's not wise to question his right to do exactly as he pleases. The psalmist tells us, as for God, his way is perfect. Whatever plan comes from the mind of the Almighty is the best plan possible. It's true that we can't expect to understand that mind perfectly, as he reminds us, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, my ways, said the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. There's other verses. Another one I can think of is, his ways are past finding out. So our responsibility to God is to obey him, to trust his word, to submit to his will, whether we understand it or not. And the fact is, we often will not understand it. In the case of the timing of Satan's ultimate demise, which is certain, it must be the best possible outcome because it's God's timing. So that's perhaps an answer to the first question. The second question I've got, I think I've got three questions altogether. The second one is, does Satan have access to heaven? Does Satan have access to heaven? Satan, as we said, was originally one of God's holy angels until he rebelled against God and was cast out. That was only the first stage of his judgment. Satan's kingdom was effectively vanquished or destroyed at the cross, and later he will be bound in the abyss for 1,000 years, and will then be cast into the lake of fire for eternity. So his eternal outcome is certain. But until his final judgment, Satan is still described as the prince of this world, John 14:30. But it seems that he still has restricted access to the heavenly realms. Think about Job, way back in the Old Testament. And we read in Job 1:6, Satan stands in the presence of God. And there's a similar situation in 2 Chronicles, so we read about a lying spirit. So Satan has access somehow to God's presence. But since God is holy and absolutely without sin, tells us that in various places, one's Isaiah 6:3, and since he will not even look on evil, as we mentioned from Habakkuk, how can Satan be in heaven? Is that possible? How could Satan be in heaven? The answer involves God's sovereign restraint of sin. Satan stood before God to give an account of himself. God initiated the meeting, led the proceedings about Job. Satan stands before God to give an account of himself. God initiated the meeting, led the proceedings, and remained in absolute control. So in that situation, Job really was in God's presence by invitation of God, so that God could do what he wanted to do at that time. God always remained in control. The result was that Satan's power, as against Job, was limited. Yes, he was given power to take away all sorts of his health and his goods and his animals and everything else, but he couldn't actually take away his life. But note this, Satan does not have open access to God. He is summoned by God, and his visits are temporary. This time, his time before God's throne is limited. So in no way is the purity and sinlessness of heaven tainted by the brief God-ordained presence of a simple being, quarantined, as it were, by God's regulatory power. And Satan's access is only granted prior to the final judgment, when he is forever destroyed. After the judgment, there's a new heaven and a new earth. Revelation 21. God wipes away all tears from our eyes, reveals the new Jerusalem, and promises complete absence of sin. And that's what we are looking forward to. When we say God cannot allow sin into heaven, we simply mean that God can't allow human beings who are still in their sin to live in his presence. If we have still got sin that's unforgiven, we've not come to him for cleansing, then we cannot live in his presence. But it's still possible for God to command a simple being to stand temporarily in his presence in order to commission him, as in Isaiah 6, to exact an account from him in Job, or to judge him in Revelation without compromising his holiness. God's holiness will eventually consume all sin. Until that day, his holiness, as it were, regulates sin. And that means that Satan, on certain occasions, is briefly summoned before his Creator to give an account of his actions. That's very, very odd, isn't it? That Satan could be allowed to continue to go to and fro on the earth. Does that mean that say that Job can be omnipresent? If Satan is tempting someone here in Bere, Regis, and is tempting somebody else in Magadugu, and tempting someone else in Sydney, is Satan omnipresent? No, he's not omnipresent. But you've got to remember, it's not just Satan. It's Satan and his angels, or Satan and his demons. So Satan is not just a sort of one entity, as it were. He is in a sense, but he's got all these, a third of the angels, remember, fell from heaven with him. I don't know how many that is, but it's bound to be a lot. And they and Satan are roaming about on this earth, seeking whom they may devour. And sadly, we are on the target list. Of course, we're also secure in our salvation. No one, and that includes Satan, can take us out of God's hands. We are safe and secure. But we are relentlessly pursued by this enemy, Satan. I can't begin to think of the damage that's been done to the cause of Christ, to all the relatives and friends of these three couples whose marriages have been destroyed. And this is a major step of achievement for Satan. Look at Job for a minute. Imagine you're in Job's situation. And here we get a situation that Job not only sort of made a bet with Satan over the outcome of Job's trial, but he provoked the bet. He actually said, you can do this, you can do that, you can do the next thing. And at the end of it all, Job doesn't even know why God allowed it in the first place. At the end of the story, all Job knows is that in the end he was far better off than he was at the beginning. And of course he was doing really well at the beginning before Satan got involved with him. You know, sometimes in our lives things can go really well. We're healthy, we've got a good job, and then somehow, for no apparent reason, it might be a health reason, it might be an employment reason, it might be a relationship reason, the rug seems to get pulled from under our feet. And our reaction is, why, God? Why have you allowed this? God never plans evil. He allows it, but he never plans it. Job finally saw that God's character and God's governance of the universe and so on is so much more wonderful than he imagined it could be, and he concedes it right at the end of the book in chapter 42. But even before that, when things were still bad, he could say these words, I know that my Redeemer liveth. In the end, after all Job's troubles, and none of us have got troubles like Job, at the end, God blesses Job with a twofold inheritance. This was not some kind of consolation prize for God's unfair treatment. Rather, it was the inheritance God promises to all who faithfully serve the Creator of the universe. Look at Daniel. Job obeyed God and was rewarded for his obedience. In the end, God's wager with Satan actually achieved an incredible coup. He harnessed evil and turned it to good, and he transformed Job into the most effective servant of all, one who took on God's own redemption character and loved his enemies. And this, in fact, is our take-home lesson from Job. Because of God's character, because of God's love for us in sending Jesus, because of Jesus dying on the cross, we have been redeemed, and we too should love our enemies. So where is our devotion this morning? Are we focused on God, focused on Jesus, or are we allowing the devil to trip us up, or to give us wrong attitudes, or to make us doubt, or all the other things that he can do to put stumbling blocks in our way of being effective Christians? There's a verse in 1 John 3:8 that says this, and we're just finishing. The one who does what is sinful is of the devil, because the devil has been sinning from the beginning. And the reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. What a fantastic verse that is. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work. I don't see that plastered up in many church walls, but there's an idea. But that's true. That's why Jesus came. Another verse, 1 John again, 5:19. The one persisting in sin, this is from the Voice translation, it's a bit different, but it sounds good. The one persisting in sin belongs to the diabolical one. That's the translator's way of describing Satan, who has been all about sin from the beginning. That is why the Son of God came into the world, to destroy the plague of destruction inflicted on the world by the diabolical one. And lastly, one other verse. We know that we are children of God, and that the whole world is under the control of God? No, the control of the evil one. Wow, that's really sobering, isn't it? We have got a battle on our hands. We need to fight the good fight. We need to stay close to Jesus. We need to be in his word. We need to be listening to his voice, because Satan is prowling around, trying to keep undercover, trying to keep sort of out of sight, but there, seeing how he may devour us. Not an opportunity